A television studio in Los Angeles. 1967. The lights are too bright and the chair is too soft, and the man sitting in it looks like he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. Audie Murphy is 42 years old. His face has changed since the war photographs that made him famous. The jaw heavier, the lines deeper, the eyes carrying something behind them that the camera cannot quite resolve. He wears a dark suit that fits him well because he is a movie star, and movie stars wear suits that fit. But his hands do not fit the suit. They are working hands. Farm hands. The hands of a boy who picked cotton until his fingers bled, and then picked cotton with bleeding fingers because the alternative was not eating. The interviewer has been asking the standard questions. The campaigns. The medals. The burning tank destroyer. Murphy answers them the way he has answered them 1,000 times, with the measured patience of a man who has learned that the truth about war does not translate into the language of television and has stopped trying to force the translation. Then the interviewer asks about weapons, about the M1 Garand, about the M1 Carbine, about the famous preference that historians have noted and that gun enthusiasts have debated and that nobody has ever fully explained to anyone who was not there. Murphy talks about the carbine, weight, speed, magazine capacity, technical details, safe territory. And then he stops. He looks at the interviewer, looks at the camera, looks at something that is not in the studio at all. Something 22 years away and 6,000 miles east in a frozen forest in France. You know, he says, "I still remember the serial number." Losses are inevitable, so you learn not to get too friendly with anybody. Every action is new people. One way or another, people come and go. But you remember the serial number of your weapon. The interviewer waits. The cameraman holds. 1108783. He says it the way a man says a telephone number he has dialed every day for 20 years. Without effort, without thought. The number is in him, the way his blood type is in him, stored in a place that does not require remembering because it was never forgotten. The interviewer does not know what to do with this. A serial number is not a dramatic revelation. It is not a medal or a battle or a moment of heroism. It is 6 digits. But the way Murphy says it makes the studio go quiet. Something in his voice. Something that tells every person in that room that they are hearing a man recite the name of the only friend he has left from a war that took everything else. To understand why those 6 digits matter. To understand why a 42-year-old man who has received every decoration for valor the United States can bestow still carries the serial number of a 5-pound weapon that half the army called a toy. You need to go back. Not to the battlefield, not to the burning tank destroyer, not to the Medal of Honor, to a cotton field. In Texas, where a boy too small for the Marines learned to shoot because his family needed to eat. The word poor does not mean the same thing everywhere. In a city, poor means less than your neighbors. It means a smaller apartment, an older car, a coat that is not warm enough. It means comparison. You are poor relative to someone who is not poor, and the measurement requires both of you to exist. In East Texas during the Depression, poor meant something different. It meant absolute. It meant the gap between what a human body requires to function and what you could provide. That body had opened so wide that you had stopped looking at the gap, because looking at it did not close it, and closing your eyes was cheaper than closing the gap. The Murphy family lived in a sharecropper's cabin outside the town of Farmersville in Hunt County. 12 children. A father named Emmett Murphy, who had, in Audie's own words from his autobiography, "To Hell and Back," a talent for producing children and little else. Emmett drifted in and out of the family's life the way weather drifts, present when it chose to be, absent when it chose to be, answerable to nothing and no one. Josie Bell. Murphy held the family together through a combination of labor faith and the particular quality of endurance that belongs to women who have been given no choice except to endure. She worked from dark to dark. She fed 12 children on what 12 children should not have been asked to survive on. She did this without complaint that anyone could hear, because she understood something that her husband never understood. Complaint is a luxury, and they had no room for luxuries. Audie was the 7th child, born June 20th, 1925. Small from the beginning, thin and quiet and watchful in a way that neighbors mistook for shyness. It was not shyness. It was assessment. Audie Murphy had been reading situations since before he had a word for what he was doing. The angle of his father's shoulders when Emmett walked through the door told him whether the night would be peaceful or violent. The sound of his mother's breathing in the next room told him whether she was sleeping or crying. He processed information through his body before his mind had time to name it. And this gift, this curse, this thing that no one trained him in, would one day make him the most lethal infantry soldier in the American Army. He left school after the 5th grade. Cotton needed picking, and the family needed the pennies that picking provided. He picked until his fingers cracked and bled, and then wrapped the cracks with strips of cloth and kept picking because the cotton did not care about his hands, and neither could he. There is a particular education that poverty provides, and it is not the education of helplessness. It is the education of inventory. When you have almost nothing, you learn to know exactly what you have. You count the beans in the jar. You count the cartridges in the box. You count the hours of daylight remaining, and the distance to the next water source, and the number of mouths that need feeding tonight. You become, without anyone teaching you, a person who tracks resources with the precision of an accountant, because the margin between surviving and not surviving is so thin that losing count of anything is the same as losing it entirely. This education would make Audie Murphy one of the most effective infantry soldiers in the history of the United States Army. Not because it taught him to fight, because it taught him to count, to know exactly how many rounds remained in his magazine at all times, to know how many yards separated him from cover, to know how many calories he had left in his body, and how many those calories could purchase in terms of distance marched or triggers pulled, to manage the invisible budget of survival that every infantry soldier operates within, and that most infantry soldiers never consciously track, because they have never lived in a place where tracking was the difference between dinner and no dinner. But there was the rifle, his grandfather's .22, a weapon so old that the stock was cracked and the recoil spring had to be worked twice before a round seated properly. Ammunition cost money. Every cartridge was a decision made before the trigger was pulled. Not a decision about the shot, a decision about whether the shot was worth the cartridge. You did not fire at a squirrel and miss. You did not fire at a rabbit and miss. A miss was a meal that did not happen. A miss was a younger sibling going to bed with their stomach touching their spine. A miss was a failure you could not undo, because the cartridge was gone and the grocery store did not extend credit to sharecroppers' sons. Audie learned to shoot in those woods the way other children learned to read. Through repetition, through consequence, through the understanding that the skill was not optional because the result of not having it was not theoretical but immediate and physical and happening to people he loved. He learned to read wind by watching grass at different distances, how a breeze from the west moved the far grass first and the near grass a moment later. What that delay told him about speed and direction. He learned to judge distance by the size of a rabbit's ear at 50 yards, at 70, at 100. He learned to hold his breath at the decision point, not at the trigger pull. Exhaling half and holding the rest, creating a window of stillness that lasted 6 or 7 seconds, in which the world went quiet and the shot happened from the quiet place, rather than from the loud one. He also learned something that would later separate him from every other soldier in the United States Army. He learned that the moment of the shot is the least important moment. The important moment is the 5 seconds before it, when the adrenaline is hot and the target is moving and every nerve in your body is screaming now. And you have to find the place inside yourself that is quieter than all of that and shoot from there. Some men are born patient. Audie Murphy was built patient by starvation and necessity. Everything soft had been burned away by the time he was 12 years old. Josie Murphy died in 1941. Audie was 16. He stood at her graveside in a cemetery outside Farmersville with dust on his boots and nothing in his pockets and the full weight of a disintegrating family on shoulders that had not yet finished growing. His younger siblings went to relatives and an orphanage. Audie found work. Odd jobs. Labor. The kind of work that uses a boy's back and does not concern itself with his future, because boys like him were not expected to have futures. They were expected to have strong backs and short lives, and the economy was structured accordingly. Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and Audie Murphy, 16 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 95 pounds, decided to go to war. The United States Marine Corps rejected him. Too small. The recruiter looked at this boy standing in front of his desk and saw a liability, not an asset. The Navy said the same thing. The paratroopers looked at his physical and sent him home. 3 branches of the American military looked at Audie Murphy and saw a boy who did not meet the minimum requirements. They measured him with scales and tape measures and decided he was inadequate. It was the army that finally took him, and only because his older sister Corinne signed an affidavit adding a year to his age. A lie on a government form. A federal crime committed by a young woman from a cotton field so that her little brother could go fight a war he was too small and too young for. Murphy shipped to Camp Walters in Mineral Wells, Texas for basic training. He was assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. 3 months of Army food had put 15 pounds on him, but he was still the smallest man in his company. And the first time he held an M1 Garand, he understood he had a problem. The Garand weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. Add a full 8-round en-bloc clip, and you were holding 10 pounds. Add a bayonet and sling, and you were at 11 or 12 pounds of steel and walnut, designed for a man of average build. 5'9", 160 pounds. Arms long enough to reach the trigger comfortably, while the butt sat in the pocket of the shoulder. Murphy was 5'5" and 110 pounds. His arms were short. The length of pull was wrong. The balance point sat forward of where his hands naturally rested. The weapon fought his body the way a tool designed for someone else always fights the person using it. Not violently, not obviously, but constantly. A small resistance on every movement. A fraction of a second lost on every time the weapon came up to the shoulder. A degree of compensation required that larger men did not have to provide. He qualified expert anyway, highest rating, because Audie Murphy could shoot anything with a barrel and a trigger regardless of how it fit him. His fundamentals were so deeply rooted, so wired into the part of his nervous system that operates below conscious thought that the mechanical disadvantage of the weapon could not overcome them. But he noticed something the instructors did not discuss. After a long march carrying the Garand and pack and ammunition and everything else an infantryman carries, his shooting degraded. Not his fundamentals, his endurance. The cumulative weight of 10 pounds across 10 miles drained something from his arms and hands that he needed when the time came to aim. The fine motor control that separated a hit from a miss at 200 yards was blunted by fatigue that a larger man would not have felt. He also noticed something else about the Garand that the Army acknowledged in its manuals, but never emphasized. The semi-automatic action that made the weapon revolutionary depended on tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Sand, mud, salt water, extreme cold. Anything that interfered with the operating rod could turn the greatest battle implement ever devised into a 9.5-pound club. Murphy had spent his life around machinery that broke. The pump on the family well, the tractor his mother's cousin owned, the .22 rifle itself, which required the bolt to be worked twice because the recoil spring was worn past its design life. He understood machines, not through theory, through the accumulated experience of living with things that failed and fixing them when they did. And the Garand, he concluded, was a brilliant weapon for a soldier who was strong enough to carry it, tall enough to handle it, and lucky enough to keep it clean. Murphy was not strong enough, was not tall enough, and suspected that luck was not a strategy. He did not complain. He observed. He filed the observation away, and he waited for a solution. The 3rd Infantry Division landed in French Morocco in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch. Murphy's education in the difference between training and reality began immediately. He learned things that no range instructor at Camp Walters had mentioned. He learned that the sound of an incoming round is different from the sound of an outgoing round, and that confusing the two gets men killed. He learned that a man who has been shot does not always fall down. Sometimes he keeps walking for 3 or 4 steps, as though the message from the wound has not yet reached his brain. He learned that the smell of a battlefield is not gunpowder, but copper and mud, and something sweet and terrible that belongs to the human body when it has been opened in ways the human body was not designed to open. He also learned that infantry combat in North Africa did not happen at the distances the manuals described. The manuals said 300, 400, 500 yards. The fields of fire they described assumed open terrain, clear sightlines. Enemies who cooperated by standing at convenient ranges. Reality said 30 yards. 50. Around corners of buildings in villages built from stone and plaster, through doorways that opened into rooms where the enemy was waiting, across narrow streets where the time between seeing a target and being seen by the target was measured in the same fraction of a second. At those distances, the Garand's long-range accuracy was irrelevant. What mattered was speed. How fast the weapon came up, how fast the target was acquired, how fast the trigger broke. Speed was measured in fractions of a second, and fractions of a second were determined by the weight and length and balance of the weapon. The Garand was 24 inches of barrel ahead of the receiver. In a doorway, that length caught on the frame. In a street crossing, it took a measurable amount of time to swing from one direction to another. In the close terrain that characterized most infantry engagements in North Africa, the Garand's length was not an asset. It was a tax, a weight paid in time, and time paid in lives. Murphy noticed that the men who survived close-range fights were the men who moved fastest. Not ran fastest, moved fastest. Weapon up, target acquired, shot fired, move. A single fluid action. And the men who moved fastest were the men with the lightest, shortest weapons. Because weight costs time, and time costs lives. The Garand men adjusted. Good soldiers adapt to their tools. But compensation is not the same as fit. A man who compensates for a tool that does not fit him is using energy that a man whose tool fits perfectly does not need to spend. That energy accumulates across a day of fighting. By evening, the compensating man is more fatigued, and fatigue in infantry combat kills as surely as bullets. Murphy filed this observation with the others. The collection was growing. He was building a theory about weapons and bodies and terrain that no manual contained and no instructor taught, because the theory required a body like his to develop it. A body small enough that every extra pound mattered. Every extra inch of barrel cost something measurable. Every ounce of energy saved on the weapon was an ounce available for the moment when energy was the difference between living and dying. The answer came in Sicily, in the hands of a man from Tennessee. Laddie Tipton was 32 years old, from Irwin, Tennessee. Tall and lanky with a slow manner of speaking that concealed quick eyes and quicker instincts. He had a 12-year-old daughter named Claudian back home, and he carried her most recent letter in the breast pocket of his field jacket, the way a priest carries a prayer book. Close. Always. He had turned down a promotion to sergeant so he could stay with Murphy as a runner. The Army does not have a form for that kind of decision. There is no box on a personnel form that reads, "I declined rank because the man I serve with is going to get himself killed if I am not beside him, and I am not willing to let that happen." Tipton understood Murphy the way a father understands a son who is too proud to ask for help. He saw the Garand fighting Murphy's body. He saw the half-second adjustment Murphy made every time he raised the weapon. The tiny compensation for a balance point that was wrong for arms that were too short. And he knew that half-second could kill Murphy the way it had killed other men in situations where half a second was the entire margin between living and dying. One evening in Sicily, after a firefight outside a village whose name neither of them learned, Tipton said what Murphy had been thinking and had not said. "That weapon does not fit you." Murphy looked at him, said nothing. "I have watched you shoot for 3 weeks, Tipton said. "You are the best shot in this company, but the Garand fights you. Every time you bring it up, you adjust. Half a second. In East Texas, that cost you a squirrel. Over here, it costs you your life." 2 days later, Tipton appeared with an M1 carbine. Where he found it, Murphy never asked. Soldiers in combat develop a relationship with supply that is not governed by requisition forms. Things appear. Things disappear. The formal economy runs on paperwork. The informal economy runs on barter, and the understanding that the man who has what you need today will need what you have tomorrow. The carbine was a Winchester with a Type 1 barrel band and a flip-up rear sight. The stock was cracked along the wrist, split by impact or concussion, discarded by someone who decided it was not worth repairing. Murphy looked at the crack, saw a familiar problem, a piece of wood stressed beyond its tolerance. The same thing had happened to his grandfather's .22 stock. He went to a communications crew, got a length of signal wire, copper core, rubber, insulated. He sat beside a stone wall and wrapped the wire around the broken stock, pulling tight at each turn, compressing the crack closed through tension rather than repair. It was not pretty. The wire-wrapped stock looked improvised, but it was functional. The crack did not spread. The wood held. He cleaned the action, oiled the bolt, loaded a 15-round magazine, took it to a makeshift range behind the company bivouac. A stretch of rocky ground with an earth bank and stones set as targets at various distances. He fired 3 magazines, 45 rounds. The weapon came up to his shoulder like a hand extending to a handshake, natural, automatic. The balance point sat directly over his hands, not forward like the Garand. The recoil was a nudge gentle enough that the sight picture barely moved between shots. 15 rounds without the interruption of the Garand's 8-round reload. And the weight, 5 pounds, half the Garand. After 45 rounds, his arms felt exactly as they had before firing. No fatigue, no tremor, no degradation. He lowered the carbine, looked at Tipton, who was leaning against the stone wall with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was the closest thing to paternal satisfaction a 32-year-old private from Tennessee could produce in a combat uniform. "That is your weapon," Tipton said. "That one, right there." Murphy turned it over in his hands, felt the wire against his palm, felt the balance, felt the way the pistol grip fit his hand, as though the factory that shaped it had measured his fingers specifically. Serial number 1108783. He did not know then that he would carry that number for 22 years. He knew only that the tool fit the hand. And for a boy from East Texas, who had spent his life learning what happens when the right tool meets the right hand, that was enough. But we are getting ahead of the story, because before the carbine went to Holtzwihr, before it went to a museum, before it became the most famous small arm of the Second World War, it had to survive the worst day of Murphy's life. The day Laddie Tipton died. And the day Audie Murphy discovered that the weapon he carried was not just a tool. It was the last connection to the only man who had ever understood why he needed it. But first, Italy. The 3rd Division landed at Anzio on January 22, 1944. The beachhead was supposed to be a springboard. It became a cage. 4 months pinned down on a flat coastal plain where the German guns on the surrounding hills could reach every square yard of Allied-held ground. There was no cover that lasted. There was no position that was safe. The shelling was not occasional. It was atmospheric. It was the weather they lived in. Murphy and Tipton shared foxholes at Anzio, because sharing a foxhole with the man you trust is the closest thing to safety that infantry combat provides, and trust between them had moved past the point where it required discussion. They did not talk about trust. They practiced it. Every hour, every night. One man slept while the other watched. One man ate while the other scanned the darkness. The rhythm of it was as natural as breathing and as essential. Tipton talked about Claudian, about the letters she sent in her careful 12-year-old handwriting, the words slanting slightly to the right, the way a child's words slant when she is trying very hard to write like a grown-up. About her drawing stick figures in crayon, a girl and a man standing in front of a house with a triangle roof and a yellow sun in the corner. Tipton folded and refolded those drawings until the creases wore through the paper. He carried them in the breast pocket of his field jacket against his chest, over his heart, which is where soldiers carry the things they cannot afford to lose. Murphy listened the way he listened to everything, completely, silently. He did not talk about his own family because there was nothing to talk about. His father was gone. His mother was dead. His siblings were scattered. The only family Murphy had was the man sitting beside him in a hole in the ground on the Italian coast, reading letters from a 12-year-old girl by the light of a single match cupped in his palm, so the Germans would not see it. One evening at Anzio, during a lull in the shelling, Tipton said something that Murphy would carry for the rest of his life. "You know why you are still alive, Murphy?" Murphy waited. "Because you are too small to hit. The Krauts keep aiming where a normal man's chest would be, and they shoot right over your head." Murphy did not laugh, but something in his face changed. A slight shift, the equivalent of sunlight moving across a wall. Tipton saw it and grinned because that shift was the only payment he wanted. Not a laugh, not a thank you. Just the evidence that somewhere behind the quiet face of the boy from Texas, something was still capable of being reached. They were brothers, not by blood, by the shared understanding that each of them was the reason the other was still breathing. There was an engagement outside a village during the breakout from Anzio in May of 1944 that demonstrated what they had built together. Company B was advancing along a road bordered by low stone walls. The road led toward a farmhouse where German observers had been directing mortar fire for 3 days. Murphy and Tipton were on point, side by side. Murphy on the left, carbine up, scanning the near terrain. The stone walls, the hedgerows, the doorways of outbuildings. Tipton on the right, Garand up, scanning the middle distance, the windows of the farmhouse. The tree line 200 yards beyond. They moved without speaking, each trusting the other to cover the sector they could not watch. The ambush came from the stone wall on the left, 30 yards. 3 German soldiers with a machine gun positioned behind a gap in the wall. The first burst went high, the gunner adjusting for the range he expected, which was taller than the target that presented itself. Murphy's carbine barked 4 times in less than 2 seconds. At 30 yards through a gap in a stone wall, 4 rounds was more than enough. In the same 2 seconds, a 4th German fired from an upper window, 140 yards behind the machine gun nest. The round hit the road between Murphy and Tipton. Tipton had already seen the muzzle flash. His Garand cracked once. The window went dark. 4 seconds. 2 threats. 2 weapons. 2 ranges. Both eliminated. Neither of them said anything afterward. There was nothing to say. The system worked. It always worked. Because 2 men who trust each other completely and carry complementary weapons create a capability that is greater than the sum of its components. And no amount of doctrine or training can replicate what 2 years of shared survival produces. That evening, Tipton sat beside Murphy and wrote a letter to Claudian. He wrote it with the stub of a pencil on paper torn from an army notebook, holding the paper on his knee, writing in the fading light of an Italian evening that smelled like cordite and dust, and the sweetness of Mediterranean wildflowers growing in the fields between the things that men had done to each other. He read part of the letter aloud to Murphy. Not the personal parts, the description of the sunset, the way the light turned the stone walls gold, the way the olive trees looked silver in the evening wind. Murphy listened, said nothing, filed it away in the deep, quiet place where the things that mattered most were stored alongside the things that hurt the most, because in Murphy's internal architecture, those 2 categories occupied the same room. 3 months later, Tipton would be dead. The letters would stop. The sunset descriptions would stop. And Murphy would carry the silence of that stopping for the rest of his life, along with the serial number and a wire-wrapped stock, and the knowledge that he could have prevented it with 5 words he did not say. But that was later. That was France. For now it was Italy. And 2 men sat beside a stone wall, and one of them wrote about sunsets, and the other one listened, and neither of them knew that the time they had left together was measured in weeks. August 15, 1944. The coast of southern France near WWII. Operation Dragoon. The invasion of southern France. The landings that history remembers less than Normandy, because Normandy happened first, and because the human capacity for absorbing the drama of amphibious assault has limits. By August of 1944, those limits had been reached. But for the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, Dragoon was not a footnote. It was a beach. It was boats. It was the particular terror of standing in a landing craft watching a coastline approach and knowing that the coastline was watching back. Company B came ashore with the first assault wave. Murphy was a staff sergeant, now acting platoon sergeant. Tipton was beside him as they moved inland. Carbine and Garand, side by side. The system that worked. Murphy would later remember the morning light on the Mediterranean, the way it turned the scrubland silver and gold, the way the air smelled of salt and wildflowers, and the particular chemical odor of gunpowder that had not yet dissipated from the naval bombardment. He remembered these things because the mind stores sensory detail from the moments before trauma, with the clarity that it does not apply to ordinary memory, as though the brain knows what is coming and is trying to preserve the last images of the world before the world changes. The platoon moved inland toward a series of hills above the beach. One hill in particular, which the Americans would call Pillbox Hill, was fortified with German machine gun positions that covered every approach. Murphy told his men to hold. He moved forward alone. With the carbine, he worked up a draw that paralleled the German positions. Narrow, carved by rainwater into the hillside, deep enough that a man could move through it in a low crouch without exposing his head. He found the first machine gun position at the top of a rise. 2 Germans behind a pile of rocks with an MG-42. He engaged with the carbine. 2 shots. Both hits. The 3rd man raised his hands. Murphy waved him back and kept moving. He found the 2nd position 40 yards further up. This one was prepared. Bullets struck the rocks around his head. A grenade bounced down the draw, detonating 15 yards behind him. Stone fragments peppered his back and legs. Murphy threw grenades of his own. Rose. Fired the carbine. Moving forward while firing, which sounds simple, and is not because the human brain does not naturally divide its attention between aiming and walking. Most men who try to do both end up doing neither well. Murphy did both, because he had spent his childhood doing both. Walking through East Texas brush while tracking rabbits. moving and aiming simultaneously from an age when other boys were learning to ride bicycles. He destroyed the second position, moved on. Then he heard boots behind him. Tipton. Murphy turned and saw the blood first. Tipton had been shot through the upper part of his left ear. The wound was bleeding heavily, soaking the collar of his field jacket dark red. Head wounds bleed like that, even minor ones. The volume of blood looks fatal even when the wound is not. Go back, laddie. Get that ear fixed. Come on, Murphy. They can kill us, but they cannot eat us. It is against the law. Here is the moment that Audie Murphy would carry as a weight, heavier than any metal for the rest of his life. Here is the moment he would replay in nightmares for 27 years until a plane crash on a Virginia mountainside stopped the replay forever. He could have ordered Tipton back. Not asked. Ordered. Murphy was the platoon sergeant. Tipton was a private first class. The chain of command was clear. Murphy had the authority to send Tipton to the rear, and Tipton, for all his stubbornness, was a soldier who followed orders when they were given as orders rather than suggestions. Murphy did not give the order. He said, "Go back." He did not say, "I am ordering you to go back." The difference between those two sentences is the distance between a request and a command. And Murphy chose the request because Tipton was his friend, and you do not give orders to your friends. You ask them, because ordering a friend feels like pulling rank on a man who has earned the right to be treated as an equal. Murphy chose friendship over authority. He chose the relationship over the regulation. And Tipton, hearing a request instead of an order, chose to stay. They moved up the draw together, found a third machine gun position, attacked it, forced the crew to surrender. And then the white flag appeared. A German soldier waved a white handkerchief. Surrender, the universal signal. In every army, in every language, in every war. White means I quit. Do not shoot. Tipton saw it. 33 years old. Father of Claudian. Veteran of Sicily and Italy, and a year of combat that should have taught him to trust nothing. But Tipton was at his core a decent man from Tennessee who believed that certain things were sacred. And a white flag was one of them. He stood up. The machine gun cut him down. The burst hit Tipton in the chest. He fell back into the draw across Murphy's legs. His mouth moved once. Murph. One word, then nothing. Murphy would write about this moment in To Hell and Back. He wrote, "I never saw one drop of blood on Laddie, but I knew he was dead. The sniper bullet must have gotten him in the heart. He died so fast." What Murphy did not write, but what anyone who reads between the lines of his memoir can feel, is the weight of the sentence he did not say on that hillside. I am ordering you to go back. 5 words, 1 second to say them. And Laddie Tipton would have gone back down the draw and had his ear fixed and been alive to hold Claudian's letters again. Murphy did not say them, and Tipton died. What happened next was not in any training manual. Murphy picked up a German machine gun from one of the destroyed positions. Picked up grenades. He attacked the remaining German positions on that hill alone. Not with the measured calculation of a professional soldier, with something older and rawer than professionalism. He killed every German he found. He raked the enemy with fire and did not stop while there was a quiver of life left in them. Those are his words. His memoir. The only time in the book where the measured language breaks and something raw and terrible comes through. The flat factual prose that Murphy maintained through hundreds of pages of combat description cracks open in this passage. For 3 paragraphs, the reader is not reading a war memoir. The reader is reading a man who has come apart and is recording the coming apart while it happens. It was not rage. Rage is hot and brief and burns itself out. This was colder, steadier. It had the focus of a man who has made a calculation and is executing the result without emotion, because the emotion has been shunted somewhere deep. Somewhere, it will wait for 27 years before it surfaces as a nightmare in a Hollywood bedroom with a loaded pistol under the pillow. When the last German position was silent, Murphy walked back down the draw. His hands were black with carbine and someone else's blood. He sat beside Tipton's body. He held the carbine across his knees. Serial number 1108783, the weapon Tipton had found for him in Sicily. The weapon a Tennessee man had given to a Texas man because he understood that the Garand did not fit Murphy's hands, because finding the right tool for a friend was the kind of thing Tipton did without being asked. Murphy received the Distinguished Service Cross for Pillbox Hill, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. He gave the medal to Tipton's 12-year-old daughter, Claudian. He mailed it with a letter. The contents of that letter are not known because Claudian kept them private for the rest of her life, as she had the right to do. He kept the carbine because the carbine was the last piece of Tipton that still functioned. The months after Pillbox Hill changed Murphy in ways the men around him could see but could not name. He stopped learning the names of replacements. The 3rd Division was burning through men at a rate that turned new faces into old memories faster than anyone could memorize them. Murphy had learned Tipton's name, had learned his daughter's name, had learned the sound of Tipton's voice and the quality of Tipton's silence, and learning those things had cost him something when the learning became useless. He would later say, "Losses are inevitable, so you learn not to get too friendly with anybody. Every action is new people. One way or another, people come and go. But the carbine stayed. The carbine did not come and go. Wood and steel and wire do not die on hillsides because they trusted a white flag." The carbine was the one connection to Tipton that Murphy could carry without risking the particular agony of caring about something that could be killed. His last friendship. The only safe one. The 3rd Division pushed north through France, the Rhone Valley, the Vosges Mountains. The Vosges in autumn were dense forest pine and fir, packed so close that visibility dropped to 30 yards. Fog in the valleys every morning. Rain that never stopped long enough for anything to dry. The carbine was perfectly suited to this environment. Engagement distances shrank to almost nothing. 20 yards. 15. The short barrel did not catch on branches. The lighter weight did not pull Murphy's arms down after 8 hours of climbing mountains. The 15-round magazine meant nearly twice as many shots before the critical moment of reloading, the 2 or 3 seconds when a soldier's hands are occupied and he is completely vulnerable. In September, near Genevreville, a mortar round exploded next to Murphy. The blast killed 2 soldiers beside him and knocked him unconscious. When he came to, he was sitting beside the crater with a broken carbine in his hands. His head ached, his eyes burned. He could not hear. The stock was split, again. Worse than Sicily. The crack ran nearly through the wrist where the wood necked down between receiver and pistol grip. Any reasonable assessment said the weapon was destroyed. Murphy wrapped it with wire. Again. Tighter. More wraps. The wire bit into the wood and compressed the crack until the surfaces mated. When he was finished, the carbine looked like something assembled in a workshop by a man with no tools and no materials, and nothing except refusal. He called it his wounded carbine. The name stuck because it was true in more ways than Murphy intended. The carbine was wounded and repaired with wire. Murphy was wounded inside in places the Army could not see, and he was holding himself together the same way. With discipline instead of wire. With routine instead of glue. With the daily act of cleaning the weapon and loading the magazine and walking toward the sound of guns, because the act of functioning was the only thing standing between Murphy and the collapse that waited on the other side of stillness. The wounded carbine was Murphy. The parallel was complete. Neither Murphy nor anyone around him would have put it into words. But every man in Company B understood it at some level below language. The officer who carried the broken weapon that still fired was also the officer who carried the broken places inside him that still functioned. The wire that held the stock together was visible. The wire that held Murphy together was not. But both were there. And both held. On October 14, 1944, Murphy received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. He was 19 years old. 11 days later, a German sniper shot him through the hip. He was in a forward position when the round hit. The hip is the body's central hinge, and when it is damaged, the body does not merely hurt. It stops working. Murphy went down hard, flat on his back in cold mud, legs unresponsive. Through the pain and the shock and the narrowing tunnel of a body trying to shut down Murphy's eyes, found the muzzle flash. The conscious mind managed the wound. The subconscious mind, the part that had been aiming since age 12, tracked the threat. He raised the carbine, one hand, pistol fashion, lying on his back, 5 pounds. The weight that had mattered in every argument about the carbine was now the weight that mattered more than anything else in the world. Raising a 10-pound Garand, one-handed from a supine position, is a physical impossibility for most human beings. Raising a 5-pound carbine is merely very difficult. Murphy did the very difficult thing. Aimed, fired, 1 round. The sniper was dead. Before the stretcher bearers arrived, a sergeant approached, looked at the wire-wrapped mud-caked carbine. "Lieutenant, if you are going home, could I have your carbine? Maybe it will bring me some luck." Murphy looked at the weapon. 1108783, Tipton's gift. The only friend that had survived every engagement he had survived. He handed it over. He knew even as his fingers released the stock that he was making a mistake. Not tactical. Emotional. The kind you recognize at the exact moment you make it and cannot stop because the momentum has already carried your hand past the point where you can pull it back. But the sergeant was asking, and Murphy was leaving. And in the arithmetic of combat, a weapon in a living man's hands is worth more than a weapon in a hospital. The sergeant walked back to his platoon carrying 1,108,783 in his hands. The following day, the platoon was nearly wiped out. The sergeant was among the dead. Murphy learned this in the hospital from a replacement who delivered the news the way replacements deliver all news from the front. Without context. As a fact stripped of the weight that only the people who knew the man could give it. The carbine was recovered from the battlefield. Repaired. The wire-wrapped stock was replaced with a standard stock because refurbishment does not account for history. It accounts for serviceability. Serial number 1108783. Filed in a warehouse at Anniston Army Depot among 6 million other M1 carbines. Murphy lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. He had given away the last piece of Tipton, and the man he gave it to was dead. He did not go home. The wound healed. Or Murphy refused to stay healed. In a hospital, there was nothing to do except think. And thinking meant Tipton standing up and the white flag and the burst and the word. In combat, the present consumed the past. In a hospital, the past consumed everything. He returned to the line in January 1945, carrying a new carbine, standard issue, no wire, no history, no Tipton. The 3rd Division was moving into Alsace, into the Colmar Pocket, the last organized German defensive position in France. The temperature dropped below 0. The ground froze so hard that entrenching tools bounced off like hitting stone. On January 23rd, the 30th Infantry Regiment was struck by a German counterattack. Company B moved up in support and was hit hard. 102 of 120 men killed or wounded in 48 hours. Every officer except Murphy was dead. He was now commanding 18 men. 2nd Lieutenant, 19 years old, responsible for 18 lives in a frozen forest against a force that outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. He positioned his men in the Bois de Riedvier, placed the 2 M10 tank destroyers astraddle the narrow road, called battalion headquarters. "Hold your position. Reinforcements on the way." They would not arrive that day. On the German side of the line, the 2nd Mountain Division was arriving. Elite troops transferred from Norway. Fresh, trained for exactly this kind of terrain and weather. A captain named Friedrich Vogt briefed his company. 250 infantry supported by 6 tanks against fewer than 20 Americans with no armor worth mentioning. Vogt ran the numbers. The mathematics were not close. This was not a battle. This was a clearance operation. He told his men they would be through the American position by nightfall. He was wrong about this. He was wrong because the mathematics of infantry combat include a variable that cannot be quantified. The variable of the individual human being who refuses to leave, who stands when the calculation says run, who climbs onto a burning vehicle because his friends are dying and he cannot walk away from that. Vogt's mathematics did not include Audie Murphy. No mathematics could. January 26, 1945, 2:14 in the afternoon. The artillery barrage hit at 2 o'clock. Murphy felt it through the frozen ground before the sound arrived the way you feel. Thunder through your boots before it reaches your ears. The shells walked through the snow-covered fields east of the Bois de Riedvier, each detonation throwing up columns of white and brown snow, and earth mixing in the air and falling back as something that was neither. Then the tanks appeared. PFC Donald Ekman, one of the 18 survivors of Company B, would remember this moment for the rest of his life. You could see the pennants on the antenna of the German tanks, Ekman recalled. That got our attention right away. We also saw a huge sea of white infantry coming toward us. 6 tanks, painted white for winter camouflage. moving in a staggered line across the open fields at approximately 10 miles per hour. Behind them, spread across 400 yards of frontage, 250 men of the 2nd Mountain Division in white snowsuits, advancing in the disciplined formations of men who have rehearsed this maneuver and believe in it. Murphy stood in his forward emplacement and watched them come. The field telephone sat on the parapet beside him, connected by wire to battalion headquarters, where the artillery forward observer waited. The new carbine was in his hands. Not 1108-783, a replacement. Standard issue. No wire, no Tipton, but it was a carbine, and it held 15 rounds, and it weighed 5 pounds, and it would have to be enough. He made the calculation in seconds. The same calculation he had been making since he was 12 years old in the woods outside Farmersville. What do I have? What do they have? What is the distance? What is the wind? What is my best chance of walking away from this? 18 men, 6 tanks, 250 infantry. No contest. Not in a straight fight. The only variable in Murphy's favor was the terrain behind him. The Bois de Riedveer was dense forest. If his men fell back into the trees, the tanks could not follow effectively. The German infantry would lose its armored support. He ordered his men back into the trees. All of them, including the crews of the 2 M10 tank destroyers. Then he stayed. He did not order anyone to stay with him. He did not ask for volunteers. He did not make a speech. He would say later, it was not a heroic act. I figured if one man could do the job, why risk the lives of others? He picked up the field telephone, dialed the artillery forward observer at battalion, began giving coordinates. The first shells came down on the German formation within minutes. Murphy's fire direction was precise, the product of 2 years of calling down strikes and learning the gap between where you tell the artillery to land and where it actually lands. The shells burst in the snow among the advancing infantry. Men went down, others scattered, but the tanks kept coming. Murphy fired the carbine. Not at the tanks. At the infantry using the tanks as moving cover. White-suited figures appearing in the gaps between armored vehicles. Murphy fired the way he had always fired. Fast. Accurate. Selecting targets with the economy of a man who had been taught at 12 years old that every round counts. Magazine empty. Reload. Fire. Magazine empty. Reload. Fire. Then a German round found the M10 on the right side of the road. The explosion was immediate and total. The tank destroyer's fuel and ammunition began to cook off. A pillar of black smoke rose into the gray January sky. Fire engulfed the vehicle, turning it from a weapon into a furnace in the space of a single breath. The crew scrambled out, ran for the trees. Murphy was out of carbine ammunition. He looked at the burning M10, at the turret, at the .50 caliber machine gun still mounted on the turret ring. The Browning M2, a weapon that could do everything the carbine could not. Penetrate cover, reach across the entire width of the field. Kill with a single round at ranges the carbine could not touch. The vehicle was on fire. It was loaded with fuel and ammunition that could detonate at any second. Standing on top of it meant standing on top of a bomb with a fuse of unknown length. Murphy climbed up. He would write about this moment in his memoir. He wrote, "My numbed brain is intent only on destroying. I am conscious only that the smoke and the turret afford a good screen, and that for the first time in 3 days, my feet are warm." His feet were warm because the vehicle beneath him was on fire. He noticed this because his feet had been frozen for 3 days and the warmth felt good. There is something so human and so strange about that detail that no one would invent it. It is too real, too specific, too much like the way the human mind actually works in extremity, noticing irrelevant details with perfect clarity, while the relevant ones blur into a continuous present tense that does not distinguish between 1 second and the next. He grabbed the .50 caliber machine gun, swung it toward the advancing Germans, and began firing. The sound of a .50 caliber is not like the sound of a rifle. A rifle cracks. The .50 caliber produces a deep concussive hammering that vibrates in the rib cage. Each round leaves the barrel at approximately 2,800 feet per second. At 100 yards, the bullet arrives before the sound does. The effect was instantaneous. The .50 caliber rounds did not merely hit the German infantry. They destroyed the things the German infantry was hiding behind. a snowbank that had stopped rifle rounds dissolved under the .50 caliber, the way paper dissolves in rain. A fallen tree trunk that had been solid cover exploded into splinters that became secondary projectiles. The wooden fence posts along a farm track that the infantry had been using as a covered approach simply ceased to exist. Murphy swept the field. He killed them in the draws, in the meadows, in the woods, wherever he saw them. An eyewitness later testified to this in the flat factual language that eyewitness testimony about extraordinary events always uses. Because the brain does not process the extraordinary with adjectives, it processes it one fact at a time, in sequence, without decoration. Below him, the tank destroyer burned hotter. The paint on the hull blistered and peeled. The engine compartment was fully engulfed. Hydraulic fluid burned with the chemical stink that Murphy could taste at the back of his throat. The ammunition stored in racks beneath the turret was heating toward the temperature at which the propellant would ignite on its own. He could feel the heat through his boots. Rising, steady, warm, then hot. Then hot enough that standing required shifting weight from foot to foot. He did not climb down. The German tanks fired at him, round after round. But the smoke from the burning vehicle had become a screen drifting across Murphy's position in heavy black curtains that opened and closed with the wind. The tankers could see the muzzle flash, but could not hold a steady aim on a target that appeared for 2 seconds and vanished behind smoke for 3. A tank round struck the road surface 20 feet to Murphy's left. The impact sent a geyser of frozen earth and gravel across the turret. Fragments hit his helmet and jacket. He turned his head away, then turned back to the gun. Kept firing. Another round hit a pine tree directly behind the tank destroyer. The tree snapped at the impact point and fell across the road. 3 to 5 round bursts. Controlled, measured, selecting targets with the patience of a boy who had been taught that every round counts, that a cartridge wasted on a miss was a cartridge that could not be spent on the shot that mattered. 15 minutes on the burning vehicle. A German squad tried to infiltrate through a drainage ditch to his right. They had crawled 400 yards on their bellies through snow. Murphy saw them, swung the .50 caliber. The ditch became a channel. The rounds traveled down it the way water travels down a gutter. The entire squad was destroyed. 20 minutes. 30. The heat from below was intense enough that the turret ring scorched his hand when he touched it without his glove. The field telephone was still working. Murphy called corrections with one hand and fired with the other. When a lieutenant at battalion headquarters asked how close the Germans were, Murphy replied, "If you just hold the phone a minute, I will let you talk to one of the bastards." 40 minutes. The German assault had stalled across the entire field. The combination of machine gun fire from above and artillery from behind had created a situation that Hauptmann Vogt had not anticipated. His calculations had included 18 Americans with rifles. They had not included the variable of one man on a burning vehicle who would not leave. 50 minutes. Murphy was hit. A round struck his leg above the knee. The impact staggered him. He grabbed the turret ring with his left hand. Blood soaked through the trouser leg. Dark against olive drab. Steaming in the cold. He shifted his weight to his uninjured leg. Found the next target. Fired. For 1 hour, Audie Murphy stood on a burning tank destroyer firing a .50 caliber machine gun and directing artillery by telephone, while 6 German tanks and 250 infantry soldiers attempted to kill him from 3 sides simultaneously. The German infantry broke. Not in the organized withdrawal that mountain troops are trained to execute. In the ragged individual movement of men who have been fighting for an hour against something they do not understand and have decided individually and without consultation that the mathematics have changed. Vogt watched the tanks withdraw toward Holzwehr and understood that his numbers had been wrong. Not the numbers on paper. Those were still correct. 250 against 18. 6 tanks against none. The mathematics that failed him were the ones that did not have a column for the will of one man who would not leave a burning vehicle while his friends sheltered in the trees behind him. There is no formula for that. There is no intelligence estimate that captures it. There is only the aftermath, which is the evidence that it happened, and the silence of the men who saw it, which is the evidence that they do not know how to explain it. The field telephone went dead. Murphy climbed down. He was bleeding. His uniform was scorched. His face was black with smoke and powder residue. He said later, "I turned from the Germans and never looked back." I was too weak from fear and exhaustion to care anymore. He limped back to the tree line. His 18 men were there. They had watched the entire thing. They had watched their 19-year-old lieutenant climb onto a burning vehicle and stay there for an hour while the German army tried to kill him. Murphy refused medical attention. He organized a counterattack, led his 18 men back across the field, and pushed the Germans to their starting positions at Holzwihr. Minutes after Murphy reached the trees, the tank destroyer exploded. The ammunition and fuel that had been burning for over an hour detonated in a single catastrophic blast that blew the turret off the vehicle and sent it spinning through the air. The turret. The platform Murphy had been standing on. The place where his boots had been warm for the first time in 3 days. 60 seconds. That was the margin. 60 seconds between Audie Murphy and a footnote that no one would ever read. He had killed or wounded approximately 50 German soldiers. He had stopped a combined arms assault that could have broken the American line and exposed the flank of the 7th Army. He had done it alone. With a telephone and a machine gun and a quality of stubbornness that was built in a cotton field in East Texas, where quitting was not an option because quitting meant your family did not eat. The next morning, the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Infantry captured Holzwihr. The Germans pulled their forces out of the area. Within 2 days, the sector was clear. Company B had held. 18 men and a lieutenant on a burning tank destroyer had held a position that 250 men and 6 tanks could not take. When asked years later why he had climbed onto that burning vehicle, Murphy's answer was 6 words. They were killing my friends. On June 2, 1945, at an airfield near Werfen, Austria, Lieutenant General Alexander M. Patch presented 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy with the Medal of Honor. The citation read in part Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. He was 19 years old. He had received every military decoration for valor the United States could bestow. 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Legion of Merit, and now the Medal of Honor. The French awarded him the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. The Belgians awarded him the Croix de Guerre with Palm. He was the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. He was also a man who would sleep with a loaded pistol under his pillow for the rest of his life. He went to Hollywood on the advice of James Cagney, who had seen Murphy's face on the cover of Life magazine in the summer of 1945. Cagney brought him to California. Murphy lived in a Hollywood gym for months because he could not afford an apartment. He took acting lessons. He learned to speak in the measured tones the camera required, rather than the East Texas drawl that combat had sharpened into something most civilians found difficult to follow. He starred in more than 40 films, most of them westerns, most of them forgettable. But in 1955, he played himself in the film adaptation of To Hell and Back, and the picture became Universal Studios' highest-grossing film until Jaws in 1975. Audiences watched a movie star portray himself climbing onto a burning tank destroyer. What they did not know was that Murphy had nightmares about that scene for weeks after filming. The set and the fire and the sound of blanks firing from the .50 caliber had pulled him back to the real Bois de Riedvier with the force that no amount of acting training could have prepared him for. He married twice. His first marriage to the actress Wanda Hendricks lasted 2 years. Hendricks later said that Murphy would wake up screaming in the night, reaching for a weapon that was not there, fighting enemies that existed only in the architecture of a brain that had been rewired by 2.5 years of daily mortal danger. She could not help him. He could not explain what needed helping. The distance between a foxhole in France and a bedroom in Hollywood could not be measured in miles. He became one of the first prominent Americans to speak publicly about what combat does to the mind. He said, "I cannot get the war out of my mind. The only difference between war and peace is that in war the danger is in front of you and you can fight it. In peace, the danger is inside you, and there is nothing to shoot at. There is nothing to shoot at." 6 words that contain more truth about combat trauma than entire textbooks on the subject. He advocated for veterans at a time when advocacy was not fashionable, when the country wanted its heroes to be triumphant and whole, when the cultural narrative required soldiers to come home and be fine because being fine was what heroes did. Murphy refused to be fine. He refused to pretend. He said publicly what thousands of veterans were saying privately in living rooms and hospitals and quiet bars where men sat with the same nightmares running the same film behind their closed eyes every night. The most decorated soldier in American history standing up and saying, "I am not okay," gave those men permission to say the same thing. Permission they had not received from their government or their families or their culture or the parade committees that celebrated the war and then forgot the warriors. That may have been Murphy's greatest act of courage. Greater than Pillbox Hill, greater than the burning tank destroyer. Standing in front of a civilian audience and admitting that the war had wounded him in places no surgeon could see and no metal could heal. He dreamed about Tipton, about the white flag, about the word, Murph. He heard it in his sleep, year after year, 27 years of the same dream. A man from Tennessee standing up because a white flag was supposed to mean something sacred. A machine gun burst that did not care about sacred things. And the 5 words Murphy did not say that would have kept his best friend alive. "I am ordering you to go back." Then the interview, 1967. The television studio in Los Angeles. Murphy says the number, 1108783. 22 years since he held the weapon. 22 years of Hollywood and bad investments and loaded pistols and dreams that pulled him back to a hill in southern France, where a man from Tennessee stood up because a white flag was supposed to mean stop shooting. An employee at the Center of Military History Clearinghouse at Anniston Army Depot heard about the interview, heard that Murphy had recited a serial number from memory, 6 digits, and thought, "I wonder." The employee searched the depot's database. Over 6 million M1 carbines had been produced during the war. 6 million weapons, each with a serial number, each with a history that the number could not contain, but that the number made recoverable. The database returned a match. Among those 6 million weapons in a warehouse in Alabama, serial number 1108783 sat on a rack among thousands of others. It had been there for decades. The wire-wrapped stock had been removed during refurbishment and replaced with the standard stock. Because the refurbishment process was designed to restore weapons to serviceability, not to preserve the stories they carried. The wire that Murphy had wrapped in Sicily and again near Genevreville was gone. The crack in the wood was gone. But the receiver was original. The heart of the weapon. The metal that carried the serial number stamped at the Winchester factory. The metal that Murphy's hands had held. The metal that Tipton had found and carried to a boy from Texas who fixed it with wire and made it his own. 1108783. They found each other through a database, through 6 digits, through the stubbornness of a man who refused to forget, and a machine that was built to remember. On May 28, 1971, a small private aircraft carrying Audie Murphy and 5 other passengers crashed into Brush Mountain near Roanoke, Virginia. Fog and rain. The pilot had been navigating through conditions that reduced visibility to near zero in the mountain passes. There were no survivors. Murphy was 45 years old. He had survived 9 campaigns and 3 wounds and malaria and an hour on a burning tank destroyer and 26 years of nightmares. He did not survive a fog bank on a mountain in Virginia. He was buried on June 7, 1971, with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Section 46. His wife Pamela and their 2 sons watched the flag-draped casket lowered into the ground. The bugler played taps. The rifle salute cracked across the cemetery. The flag was folded and presented. The headstone is white marble, the same as every other headstone at Arlington. The same size, the same shape, the same font. Because the cemetery does not distinguish between the most decorated soldier in American history and the private who served one tour and came home quietly. They are all equal in the ground. Murphy would have understood that. The boy too small for the Marines buried among presidents and generals. His grave remains one of the most visited at Arlington. Not by scholars, not by military officials, by ordinary Americans who drive from towns not unlike Farmersville, Texas, to stand in front of a white marble stone and recognize something in the story of the man beneath it. Something about being told you are too small and proving that size is not the same as stature. Something about carrying a weapon everyone else dismissed and being right. Something about standing on a burning vehicle because the people behind you needed you to stand. Today, the carbine sits in a display case at the 3rd Infantry Division Museum. Serial number 1108783. The placard identifies it as the personal weapon of the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. It does not mention Laddie Tipton. It does not mention the wire that held the stock together through the Vosges and the Colmar pocket and every frozen mile between Sicily and Alsace. It does not mention Claudine, who was 12 years old when her father was killed by a false surrender on a hill in southern France and who received a Distinguished Service Cross instead of a father coming home. But the number is there. 1108783, stamped into metal at the Winchester factory, carried across 3 continents. Spoken aloud in a television studio by a man who had forgotten how to sleep but had not forgotten how to remember. The best weapon is not the most powerful one. The best weapon is the one that fits the man. And the man who fits no measurement the army takes. Who is too small and too light and too young for every branch of service, except the one that finally said yes. Sometimes turns out to be the man the army cannot measure, cannot predict, cannot replace. 1108783. He remembered it because forgetting it would have meant forgetting Tipton. And forgetting Tipton was the one thing Murphy could not do. Not in the Vosges, not in Hollywood, not in the nightmares, not ever. Some things survive the fire, even when the fire takes everything else.